Hello, my name is Koen Vacano and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. My project is about the reception of epic poetics in popular fantasy franchises. In this paper, I would like to talk about world building from Homer to Star Wars. In current popular discourse, transmedia fantasy franchises like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter and the Marvel Cinematic Universe are constantly called epic. So far, however, classical reception scholarship has been hesitant to consider these franchises in relation to the classical epic tradition. The word epic today often means not much more than just great, and apart from heroic characters and grand battles, there seems to be little which connects them to Homer and Virgil. Some scholars have identified classical themes and influences in these franchises. For example, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall has been recognized as an influence on the plot of the Star Wars franchise, which shows a galactic republic become an empire, subsequently toppled by rebels. Yet profound connections with ancient epics seem difficult to establish, as in these fantastical story worlds, classical antiquity is often just one element in an inclusive pastiche of influences. In this paper, I explore a new approach to conceptualize the relationship of these franchises to the classical tradition. I argue that if we shift our focus from the intentional adaptation of classical themes and content to poetic form and function, we may discover surprising continuity between ancient epic and popular fantasy. A brief look at the original Star Wars film may serve to illustrate what I mean. While there is little in the futuristic story world which references Homer or Virgil or any other epicist, its opening sequence can be tentatively described as a cinematic prome. Afterwards, indeed, we are literally dropped in medias res, as a space battle appears to have been already going on even as we were reading the text. Later in the film, there is even a scene which may remind us of an epic catalogue, traditionally a list of troops given before the beginning of a major battle.
All wings report in.
Red 10 standing by.
Red 7 standing by.
Red 3 standing by.
Red 6 standing by.
Red 9 standing by.
Red 2 standing by.
Red 11 standing by.
Red 5 standing by.
Lock S-foils in attack position.
Now, of course, with formal parallels like these, it is difficult to prove that we are dealing with an intentional reception of antiquity. In fact, it is likely that in many cases, such similarities depend on coincidence or very diffuse and difficult to trace forms of reception. The prome of Star Wars, for example, was primarily inspired by the similar opening of the Flash Gordon serials of the 1930s. Nevertheless, I believe studying these parallels is worth our time, for at least two reasons. First, they may lead us to consider different and deeper forms of cultural continuity which are not bound by authorial intention and intertextual games and which may be translated between media. Second, these similarities may stimulate us to compare our present-day experience of films and other media to the functioning of ancient culture, as well as make us consider the applicability of theories from film and media studies to ancient literature, and vice versa. Thus, studying the comparability between classical and cinematic epic may function as a heuristic tool to gain new insights in both. To illustrate these benefits, in the remainder of this paper, I will work out a case study comparing Star Wars, arguably the most influential transmedia fantasy film franchise, and Homeric epic. The point of comparison will be the notion of world building, an emergent topic in media studies, which I believe may inspire new discussions and interpretations about the workings and continuity of epic poetics in ancient literature and popular fantasy. World building has been analyzed as a key feature of the contemporary fantasy franchises we have been discussing, and it has been defined as the suggestion of a coherent fictional world, often spanning across multiple media, with its own peoples, cultures, history, etc. Mark Wolf, who together with Mary Laure Ryan, Henry Jenkins and Dan Hasler Forrest has been one of the most influential theorists of world building, has described several ways in which works may create this suggestion. First, by including a wealth of elements which are not necessary for the plot per se, authors may give their story worlds a sense of verisimilitude and depth. For example, Woolf observes, in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, characters mention names, sing songs, and speak languages which are not known and not explained to the reader, and which thus create the illusion of a coherent and history-filled secondary world, an effect which is enhanced by several appendices containing detailed timelines, genealogies, and maps of Middle-earth. Second, as these imaginary worlds are often returned to in a variety of other works and media, as well as in fan responses, they may continue to expand over time, increasing in depth and realism. Star Wars, for example, started as a single film, but now has an official database called the Holocron, which paints a highly detailed picture of the Star Wars universe, the result of years of adding to by various authors, works, and media. Now, even though world-building is generally considered to originate in Tolkien's Middle-earth, I believe that based on the formal elements shared between Star Wars and ancient epic, which we identified earlier, there is a case to be made that world-building is a much more continuous phenomenon between antiquity and the present. Indeed, that some of the most typical elements of epic poetry can be considered powerful world-building tools which continue to be used to similar effect in contemporary media. Consider again the epic in medias res opening, which we identified in Star Wars. Without any further explanation, we are told of rebel spaceships fighting against the Galactic Empire, as if its existence should be obvious to us. After the opening crawl, we are literally in the midst of an ongoing battle. We are confronted with unfamiliar spaceships, unknown droids in the middle of a conversation.
Did you hear that? They shut down the main reactor. We'll be destroyed for sure. This is madness.
And an enigmatic villain. This powerful sense of being directly immersed in the imaginary world, which was quite a cinematic innovation at the time, has been described by scholars as an important cause for the film's success. Yet how exactly is this effect produced? I think a look at the ancient poetic technique might help us understand this. Horace, who coined the in medias res phrase in a discussion of Homeric epic, describes it as follows. Ever Homer hastens to the issue, and hurries his hearer into the middle of things, as if already known. The in medias res phrase here has generally gotten most of the attention, and has been interpreted, in line with several remarks to the same effect in Aristotle's Poetics, as the simple injunction not to treat all of the potential subject matter, but to select one section in the middle, containing a single and unified action, as Homer did with his Iliad. The Homeric audience, as is generally assumed, would have been familiar with the Trojan subject matter, so that the singer could start at whatever point he thought most suitable. Yet for Horace, the foremost introduction to the Trojan subject matter might have been the Iliad itself. And so, as the far less cited second part of his remark reveals, he does not so much consider Homer to selectively treat familiar subject matter, but rather to treat unfamiliar subject matter as if it were familiar. From this perspective, Homer's in medias res beginning is essentially a poetic illusion of depth, which works by giving us too little background information to completely understand what's going on, but just enough to suggest that beyond what we can actually read and grasp, this has to be a whole lot. As Horace says a couple of lines before, the poet thinks not how to give you smoke from light, but light from smoke. By giving us the suggestive illusion of smoke, we are made to imagine the underlying presence of light. In this sense, what Horace saw in Homer is really not unlike the world-building techniques theorists like Woolf have identified in Tolkien, which, as I explained before, are similarly considered to be based upon the inclusion of a host of suggestive details. This was the intended effect of Star Wars as well, even if, again, it was not inspired by Homeric epic, but rather by the Flash Gordon serials. As a new episode of the serial was shown in the cinemas every week, most kids were first encountering the serial somewhere halfway through its run, being left to guess and discuss with their friends what they had missed. It was this effect that Lucas was after, and that caused him to inadvertently replicate the effect Homer once had on Horace. This parallel not only presents us with a possibly surprising sense of continuity between classical and cinematic epic, but may also increase our understanding of how the in medias res technique works. In particular, both Horace and Star Wars make clear that its effect may vary with the amount of pre-existing knowledge of the fictional world the audience has. Just as Horace experienced the beginning of the Homeric poems as more suggestive than the archaic Greek audience probably would have, so, conversely, people who nowadays watch the opening of the original Star Wars film after first becoming familiar with its story world, for example, through the prequel films or the Clone Wars television series, may not experience its originally startling effect as such. Like the in medias res beginning, catalogues or lists are another characteristic feature of ancient epic. The paradigmatic example is the catalogue of ships in Iliad 2, but there are other catalogues-like scenes as well. For example, a series of objects may be listed in gift-giving scenes, or a series of dying heroes in mass battles. In many cases, epic authors do not merely enumerate, but use the listed items as an occasion to insert narrative vignettes, generally concerning the backstory of the items in question. For example, when Homer lists the troops of Melibea in his catalogue of ships, he states that these, with their 7 ships, were led by Philoctetes, well skilled in archery. But Philoctetes lay suffering grievous pains in an island, even in sacred Lemnos, where the sons of the Achaeans had left him in anguish with an evil wound from a deadly water snake. There he lay suffering. Philoctetes, then, is not in Troy, and he is never mentioned in the Iliad again, but the poet makes time for this vague and suggestive mini-narrative in the catalogue. Thus, it appears, the catalogue is a ready-made world-building device, a convenient technique for expanding the fictional world beyond the scope of the narrative proper and providing it with a sense of history and depth. There are several catalogue-like scenes in the Star Wars films which may be considered to function in exactly this way. Take this extensive montage of dying Jedi, which may remind us of the enumerations of death in epic mass battles. Again, all of the characters we see had insignificant, mostly non-speaking roles in the films, but in this catalogue of deaths, they are all getting a moment of personal attention. It suggests, if nothing else, that there are significant characters in the Star Wars universe other than the main protagonists, each with their own personality, history, and story to tell, even if they are not told in the film itself. In fact, in the modern transmedia landscape, such stories hinted at in the main films may be worked out in other media. Take, for example, this Jedi. In the films, the strange-looking character is given neither name nor any lines. His main role is dying in this catalogue sequence. Yet he was given a name and even his own action figure in the merchandising surrounding the film's release. Moreover, the backstory of Plo Koon, as he is known, was later worked out in the animated television series The Clone Wars and several comic books. So, in this case, the suggestive evocation of a larger world in the film was supplemented by its actual realization in other media. The cinematic catalogue, then, can be a strong anchor for what has been called transmedia world-building. By and large, scholarship has intriguingly not considered the possibility of such effects in ancient epic catalogues. Arguably, this is because the traditions and assumptions of Homeric criticism have made it difficult to think of catalogues in this way. Ever since the oral theory of Milman Parry, Homeric catalogues have generally been considered to reflect the deepest roots of the epic in the non-literary past, wherein they would have functioned to preserve historical knowledge. Recent scholarship has echoed this interpretation, conceiving of catalogues as repositories of knowledge and information, showcases for singers to display their mnemonic capabilities, and the closest thing to an encyclopedia entry offered by early antiquity. Thus, the tendencies of modern Homeric criticism have been, first, to predominantly study the catalogues in their primary context of Homeric singers and their audience, and second, to consider them, in this context, to be records of cultural lore which was essentially common knowledge. Thus, according to this theory, ancient catalogues cannot do world-building because, in effect, the mythological world was already completely built. Anyone reading or hearing the passage about Philoctetes, the assumption would have been already familiar with the story. an assumption which is strengthened for classicists by our common practice of approaching the text with a commentary in hand, which is sure to tell us the details of the story known from later authors like Sophocles. Yet while I do not presume to know what knowledge ancient audiences and readers of Homer may or may not have had, it is inevitable that it would have varied in different times, places, and reception contexts, as we discussed previously with regards to Horace's experience of Homeric beginnings. In Roman times, for many readers, the tiny section in the catalogue of ships may have been their first encounter with Philoctetes, and it is not improbable that the same would have applied to some of the audience members in archaic Greece as well, who happened to come across the Homeric songs before learning about Philoctetes via other traditions which we now consider to be reflected in the epic cycle. For these ancient audiences, the Philoctetes passage may have been equally suggestive of an unfamiliar world as the Star Wars catalogue is for us. They learned of a leader who was not even in Troy, but is still for some reason important enough to be mentioned. Why, they may have asked. Also, why was he bitten by a snake? Why was he left behind? Why didn't his companions help him or at least take him with them? They are not told, though it is all told, to quote Horace again, as if they should have known. For these readers and listeners, which we may assume grew in number over the years as Homer increasingly eclipsed the cyclical epics, the passage may suggest the presence of a whole unfamiliar world behind the text as the Jedi Death Catalogue did in Star Wars. There is even a tentative case to be made that the Homeric catalogue had what we would nowadays call a transmedia function. Of course, the Trojan Cycle was decidedly not a tightly and commercially controlled franchise, but, as has been well attested by years of classical scholarship, Homeric epic eventually came to operate as a central node in a mythological story world consisting of an intertextual network stretched out over various media, from epic performances to stage plays and literature. It has been observed that later texts, like Attic tragedies, frequently take Homeric characters, but explore precisely the parts of their stories which are left suggestively vague by Homer. In Sophocles' Philoctetes, for example, we get the answers to all of the questions evoked by the Iliadic passage. We learn why Philoctetes matters at all, namely because of a prophecy stating that his bow was necessary for Troy to fall. And his being left behind is also explained, as a result of the terrible smell of his foot wound. In this way, these texts have essentially realized the backstory of the story world which was only hinted at in Homer. Some readers, both ancient and later, would have encountered Homer's suggestive mini-narrative first, while others would have come to Homer equipped with the knowledge provided by other nodes in the intertextual landscape, like Sophocles or the cyclical epics. Their experiences will have varied accordingly, but in any case, the poetic structure of the epic catalogue functions in this transmedia network as a powerful world-building tool, creating the illusion of a world which extends far beyond the epic itself. And it continues to do so in modern fantasy franchises like Star Wars. In conclusion, what I hope to have shown is that considering continuity in classical form instead of content may open up valuable views on both ancient and modern epic. It may make us see surprising continuity in poetic techniques, in my example here in the use of in medias res beginnings and catalogues for world-building effects. It may also serve as a heuristic prism which may make us reconsider our interpretations of both classical and contemporary epic, each being cast in a different light by the comparative frame of the other. In my case study, it resulted in a preliminary questioning of how diverging sets of foreknowledge, resulting from different routes through transmedia story worlds, might affect one's experience of world-building techniques encountered in the epic. Thus, I hope, the study of the persistent relevance of classics to contemporary pop culture may be expanded into the realm of poetic form. I thank you for your interest in my paper, and I look forward to discussing my ideas with you during the panel session. If you have any further questions or remarks, you can email me at the following address. Thank you.